London, Paul McCartney's home, December 8, 1980, 9:47 p.m. The intimate dinner party at Paul McCartney's St. John's Wood home had been filled with gentle conversation and laughter among close friends when Freddie Mercury, who had been unusually quiet all evening, suddenly stood up from the piano where he'd been absently playing soft melodies. "Paul," Freddie said, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic vulnerability, "there's something I need to share with you. A song that changed my life, that made me believe music could touch souls." What followed was Freddie's deeply personal rendition of The Long and Winding Road, not performed as entertainment, but as a heartfelt tribute from one artist to another. Paul McCartney, who had written the song during one of the most difficult periods of his life, listened in stunned silence as Freddie transformed his composition into something even more emotionally powerful than he had ever imagined possible. When the final note faded, Paul's eyes were filled with tears, and his response would create a moment of artistic connection so profound that everyone present knew they had witnessed something truly magical. If you want to discover why Freddie Mercury chose that particular Beatles song, what Paul McCartney's deeply personal reaction revealed about the power of musical interpretation, and how one private performance created a friendship that would last until Freddie's final days, please subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because this story proves that the most beautiful musical moments happen when artists stop performing for audiences and start sharing their souls with each other. But this story doesn't begin with that dinner party revelation. It starts 18 months earlier, when Freddie first heard The Long and Winding Road during a period of profound personal reflection. June 1979, London. Freddie Mercury was going through one of the most introspective phases of his career. Queen had achieved massive success, but with fame came isolation, and Freddie found himself searching for music that spoke to deeper emotional truths rather than just entertaining crowds. During a quiet evening at Garden Lodge, Freddie was listening to Beatles albums when The Long and Winding Road stopped him completely. Something about Paul's vulnerable vocal delivery and the song's theme of searching for home and meaning resonated with feelings Freddie had been unable to articulate. "I must have played that song 50 times that night," Freddie later told Mary Austin. "It was like Paul had written the soundtrack to my own emotional journey. I felt understood by someone I'd never met." Freddie began incorporating elements of the song into his private practice sessions, not to perform it publicly, but to understand how such simple lyrics could carry such profound emotional weight. He studied Paul's phrasing, his use of silence, and the way vulnerability could make a performance more powerful than any technical virtuosity. Freddie was fascinated by how Paul could convey complete stories with just a few words and emotional honesty, observed Brian May, who sometimes found Freddie working through Beatles songs at their rehearsal space. He saw it as a masterclass in connecting with listeners on a human level. The admiration was particularly meaningful because Freddie had always felt somewhat intimidated by the Beatles' legacy. While Queen was achieving their own success, the Beatles represented a level of cultural impact that seemed almost impossible to match. Freddie respected many artists, but he was in awe of the Beatles, reflected Roger Taylor. They'd proven that rock music could be both commercially successful and artistically significant. That was exactly what Queen was trying to achieve. December 1980 brought an unexpected opportunity for Freddie to meet one of his musical heroes. Paul McCartney was hosting a small gathering at his London home, and through mutual industry connections, Freddie received an invitation. "It wasn't a big party," recalled Linda McCartney years later. "Just 15 or 20 people, musicians, producers, close friends. Paul wanted it to feel intimate and relaxed." Freddie approached the evening with unusual nervousness. This wasn't a public event where he could rely on his Freddie Mercury persona. This was a chance to meet Paul McCartney as simply Farrokh, the music lover who had been moved by Beatles songs since childhood. "I'd never seen Freddie so anxious about meeting anyone," Mary Austin remembered. "He changed outfits 3 times and kept asking me if he looked too theatrical. He wanted Paul to see him as a serious musician, not just a rock star." December 8, 1980, 7:30 p.m., Freddie arrived at Paul's home to find exactly the kind of evening he'd hoped for: intimate, musical, and focused on artistry rather than celebrity. Paul's piano was the centerpiece of the living room, and guests were encouraged to share music informally. Paul was incredibly welcoming, Freddie recalled afterward. He didn't treat me like a visiting rock star. He treated me like a fellow musician who loved music as much as he did. The evening progressed with various guests sharing songs, stories, and musical insights. Freddie participated in conversations but remained largely observant, absorbing the experience of being among musicians he deeply respected. Freddie was uncharacteristically quiet, observed Wings guitarist Denny Laine, who was present that evening. You could tell he was taking everything in, studying how Paul interacted with music in this informal setting. As the evening developed, Paul began sharing stories behind various Beatles songs, explaining the emotional contexts that had inspired their creation. When he mentioned The Long and Winding Road, Freddie's attention became completely focused. Paul talked about writing that song during a period when the Beatles were falling apart, remembered producer George Martin, who was also present. He described feeling lost and searching for some kind of resolution. Freddie was hanging on every word. 9:30 p.m. The conversation had moved toward Paul's piano, where he was demonstrating different ways he'd approached certain Beatles compositions. Several guests had taken turns sharing their own musical interpretations, creating an atmosphere of artistic exchange rather than performance. It felt like a musical salon from another era, recalled photographer Linda McCartney. Artists sharing their work with other artists, not for any audience except each other. Freddie had been sitting quietly near the piano, following the musical conversations with obvious engagement, but not participating directly. When Paul finished demonstrating the bridge section of Let It Be, there was a moment of reflective silence. That's when Freddie stood up, walked to the piano, and made his request. "Paul," Freddie said, his voice carrying none of his usual theatrical confidence. "There's something I need to share with you. A song that changed my life, that made me believe music could touch souls." The room fell quiet. Everyone present recognized that something significant was about to happen. "Freddie looked different than I'd ever seen him," observed Wings drummer Steve Holley. "All the rock star persona was gone. He looked like someone about to share something deeply personal." Paul stepped away from the piano, giving Freddie space but remaining close enough to observe every nuance of what was about to unfold. Freddie sat at the piano and began playing The Long and Winding Road, but not as anyone had ever heard it before. His interpretation was slower, more intimate, with pauses that allowed the emotional weight of each phrase to resonate fully. His voice carried a vulnerability that even Paul had never quite achieved in the original recording. Freddie wasn't performing the song, Paul reflected years later. He was living it. Every word seemed to come from personal experience. As Freddie sang, the entire room became transfixed. This wasn't the powerful, commanding voice that filled stadiums. This was someone using his extraordinary vocal gifts to communicate pure emotion. You could hear everything in Freddie's voice, remembered producer George Martin. Longing, hope, search for meaning. He was using Paul's words to tell his own story. But what made the performance truly extraordinary was how Freddie maintained eye contact with Paul throughout the song. This wasn't a demonstration of vocal ability. It was one artist speaking directly to another through their shared language of music. Freddie was singing to Paul, not for him, observed Linda McCartney. It was like watching someone deliver a personal letter through music. When Freddie reached the song's climax, "The Long and Winding Road That Leads to Your Door," his voice broke slightly, not from technical failure but from genuine emotion. In that moment, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Paul McCartney, who had heard thousands of interpretations of his songs over the years, stood mesmerized. Tears began forming in his eyes as he recognized that his composition was being elevated to heights he had never imagined possible. As Freddie sang the final verse, his voice became even more intimate, transforming Paul's already beautiful melody into something that seemed to capture every human longing for connection and understanding. When the last note faded, the silence in the room was profound. Everyone present knew they had experienced something extraordinary, but no one wanted to break the spell with applause or conversation. Paul walked slowly to the piano where Freddie remained seated, tears now visible on his cheeks. What Paul said next created a moment that everyone present remembered for the rest of their lives. "Freddie," Paul said, his voice thick with emotion, "I wrote that song, but you just taught me what it really means." Paul placed his hand on Freddie's shoulder, and for a moment, two of music's greatest voices shared complete understanding without need for additional words. Paul was crying, remembered Linda McCartney, not from sadness but from recognition. He'd heard his song performed with such depth and personal meaning that it had become something new while remaining completely faithful to his original vision. What followed was a conversation between Paul and Freddie about music, artistry, and the responsibility artists have to honor the emotional truth of songs, regardless of who originally wrote them. Paul told Freddie that hearing his song performed with such personal connection reminded him why he'd started writing music in the first place, recalled George Martin. "It wasn't about commercial success or critical acclaim. It was about touching other people's hearts." Freddie, still emotional from his performance, thanked Paul for creating music that had provided comfort during difficult periods of his own life. He explained how The Long and Winding Road had become a source of solace during moments when fame felt isolating. Freddie told Paul that Beatles songs had been like friends when he felt most alone, remembered Denny Laine. He said that hearing Paul's vulnerability in songs like The Long and Winding Road made him feel less isolated in his own struggles. The conversation revealed how both artists, despite their massive success, still grappled with the same human needs for connection, understanding, and authentic expression that their music addressed. They were discovering that their experiences as artists were more similar than different, observed Steve Hawley. Fame hadn't eliminated their need for genuine human connection. If anything, it had made that need more acute. The evening continued with Paul and Freddie sharing other songs and stories, but the performance of The Long and Winding Road had created a bond that would last for years. After that night, Paul and Freddie maintained a friendship that was based on mutual artistic respect, Linda McCartney revealed. They would call each other to discuss new music, share ideas, and offer support during challenging creative periods. The private performance also influenced how both artists approached their own music going forward. Paul began incorporating more of the intimate, vulnerable qualities that had made Freddie's interpretation so powerful, while Freddie gained confidence in his ability to convey deep emotion without sacrificing his theatrical style. That evening taught both of them that the most powerful performances come from emotional honesty, reflected George Martin. Technical skill is important, but connection with the audience, even an audience of one, requires something deeper. The story of Freddie's performance remained largely private for years, shared only among the intimate circle who had witnessed it. But when it eventually became known in music circles, it became a legendary example of how great artists honor each other's work. Musicians still talk about that performance, noted music historian Dr. Sarah Williams. It represents everything beautiful about artistic interpretation, taking someone else's creation and finding new emotional depths while remaining completely faithful to the original spirit. For Paul McCartney, Freddie's interpretation of The Long and Winding Road became one of his most treasured musical memories. He often cited it as proof that songs, once released into the world, can take on lives and meanings beyond what their creators originally intended. "Freddie showed me that my song could be even more than I thought it was," Paul reflected in later interviews. "He found emotional territories in it that I hadn't fully explored." That's the highest compliment one artist can give another. The performance also demonstrated Freddie Mercury's extraordinary range as an interpreter of music. While audiences knew him for his powerful rock vocals, the intimate Beatles performance revealed his ability to convey profound vulnerability and emotional truth. That night proved that Freddie was more than just a great rock singer, observed Brian May years later. He was a complete artist who could inhabit any song and make it completely his own while honoring its original essence. Today, the story of Freddie's private performance for Paul McCartney is remembered as one of music's most beautiful examples of artistic connection. It proves that the most meaningful musical moments often happen away from stages and recording studios, in intimate settings where artists can share their souls without pretense. The tears in Paul McCartney's eyes that December evening weren't just about hearing his song performed beautifully. They were about witnessing the power of music to create understanding, connection, and recognition between kindred spirits who had dedicated their lives to touching other people's hearts through sound. Subscribe to discover more stories of intimate musical moments, the private performances that created lasting friendships, and proof that the most beautiful art happens when artists stop trying to impress and start sharing their deepest truths. Because sometimes the most powerful audiences are the people who understand exactly what you're trying to express.